I'm National Wellbeing Lead at Twinkl. Really pleased to have you here. Just to say, please do have a look at all of the other TeachMeets that we're running through the Wellbeing Hub. So next week I'm running one on stress awareness, and then we've also got some sessions coming up on whole school approach to mental health and wellbeing, and one for preparing for Mental Health Awareness Week. So have a look at the other sessions that we've got coming up. Really looking forward to today's session. Those practical strategies that you're going to walk away with. Gemma is fantastic at this, and the work that she does with Cog-Spark is brilliant, so definitely look up what they are doing as well. And that's all from me. I'm going to hand over to you, Gemma.
Okay, thank you, Becky. So a warm welcome, everybody. Delighted that you're joining me this afternoon, hoping your days have gone okay and that you had a lovely Easter break. So today, as Becky was saying, we're going to be thinking about primary school settings. We'll be thinking about kind of the landscape of anxiety and its presentation, and also then some practical strategies. There might be moments during the webinar where I just stop and pause to allow you to reflect on some of the content or reflections or questions that I'm posing, because I think it can be quite helpful to kind of think about your roles, your setting, and probably as you're listening, maybe some of the children that you work with might come to mind, or you might already be joining, hoping to have some kind of ideas of those practical strategies as well. Just very briefly, introduction so that you know if you've not met me before. So as Becky was saying, I work with Jessica Parker. We founded Cog-Spark after working together for many years. My background actually was working in the NHS as a mental health nurse and clinician before moving into education, probably about 12, 13 years ago. So just a warm welcome to everybody giving up your time today. I just want to also kind of bring to this space today just the importance of kind of a safety agreement. We joined the webinar today, not just our professional roles, having worked in education for a number of years, many staff are also thinking about their own children and young people in their lives as well. So just kind of protect your own well-being, engage with care. Do take those opportunities when I just stop and pause for you maybe to kind of think about how it connects within your setting as well, but being mindful of your own well-being as well. Recognizing that, we all have our own unique experiences. And I think when we begin and start to think about anxiety as well, I think really thinking about, those foundations and recognizing that, our children, everybody will experience some level of anxiety at some point. But for some of our children and young people, unfortunately, anxiety starts to take a hold and have an impact. But each of those experiences are unique to that child. And also what we see and know is that anxiety can develop for a number of reasons as well. So I'll introduce you, if you haven't come across it before, thinking about anxiety being on a continuum as well. And I suppose kind of my aim today is that we can learn together. So we've got the question and answers at the end in a way that supports both our pupils' well-being, but also our own as well. So that, if we are at our best, kind of looking after our own self and well-being, those connections that we have with our children and young people. So in those moments where things might be really tricky or really challenging, what's really important as well is for us to be as calm and regulated as we can. And I don't know about for anybody else, but also it's an opportunity for us to think about how we can gift our knowledge and awareness to the children that we support, and also to our parent and carers. And I think before we even begin, I would probably reflect on an interaction that I was having with a Year 5 pupil just before the Easter break, where they were saying, you know, my teacher's absolutely fantastic, Gemma, you know, they come up with lots of ideas and strategies, but actually I just want somebody to listen to me, because in many ways I know what's going to be helpful for me. So also what we can maybe do is just take those moments to think about, you know, being led also by pupils who maybe are finding things difficult, but might actually have some strategies that they recognise that can be helpful for them as well. So just holding in mind that shared understanding as well. So what am I going to cover? So we're going to think about recognising those common signs of anxiety. I think, you know, we can't look at strategies without kind of just touching base and reminding ourselves of what some of those signs of anxiety might be as well. We'll think about classroom triggers, and again at the end, if anybody wants to reflect back or share anything, absolutely make sure that you do with the questions as well, so that we can think about applying those preventative strategies as well to reduce them. So the idea being there is actually, you know, sometimes the behaviours that we might be observing and seeing might not be things that necessarily we've thought about as anxiety and the presentation of anxiety. And then thinking about those practical strategies to support anxious pupils during everyday classroom routines. And I think there as well, just holding in mind, you know, things like the experiences of COVID pandemic, the lockdown, where maybe I'm sure for yourselves as well in your primary school settings, noticing the challenges faced as well. So what I'm just going to ask you to do for a moment is just to really think about imagining that every child arrives with an invisible backpack. So for us to hold in mind that our pupils during their early years might be carrying worry, they might be carrying that fear of failure. It might be, for example, family stress, sensory overload. And for us to just stop and pause and think about how this may affect their learning and behaviour. So just have a moment to really think about, you know, what you might be observing, what you might be seeing, and really then the impact on learning and behaviour. So we will be thinking about the fight, flight, freeze, fawn response, and also thinking about anxiety can present in a variety of ways as well, so that sometimes we might notice, you know, that anxiety, that avoidance, you know, maybe emotionally based avoidance, but equally as well it could be that our children present, you know, feeling quite angry and overwhelmed and irritable, so that we can think about, you know, some of our pupils we might already recognise that they're experiencing higher levels of anxiety, but some of our children, maybe the importance of that curiosity as well, and kind of thinking about what might be going on for that young person as well. So this isn't an exhaustive list, it's about us just kind of stopping, pausing and thinking, actually our pupils arrive in school, don't they, each and every day with their own unique experiences and things that might be going on. So it could be a child who, you know, that fear of failure, you know, they're worrying, concerned that, you know, their spelling's test or, you know, writing, they're not going to achieve what they're setting themselves as well. And I don't know for anybody else, I think, you know, thinking about, and often I kind of reflect on the children that have been or are in my life, where, you know, sometimes it just becomes overwhelmed, doesn't it? I'm not even going to try this. What's the point? I've already made a mistake, and actually just wanting to kind of bolt and run away from things, and then actually that fear becoming the fear of the fear, and we see that with the anxiety cycle as well. So what we do know is that it's really important also to remember that children often lack the language or emotional awareness to say, I feel anxious or I feel low. Instead, they may communicate through behaviour, but also they might communicate it in different ways. So instead of maybe understanding about anxiety, I think some of our children are amazing, aren't they? They can absolutely articulate exactly how they're feeling because they've got got that emotional vocabulary, but it still takes, being brave, doesn't it, to sometimes communicate those feelings and emotions. So sometimes the child might say, I've got a tummy ache, I've got a headache. So they'll be able to kind of describe the physical feelings, but find it really difficult to describe those emotions as well. So we do know that anxiety is one of the most common emotional challenges faced by children today. I kind of mentioned about, COVID and the pandemic, but equally as well, I think holding in mind, the current societal challenges. And, we will all join today in different settings and in different areas of the country. So it might be your own community challenges, but also those societal challenges. We've got war and conflict. We've got lots of uncertainty and unknowns, and I think those increased vulnerabilities and experiences can be shaping how our children feel, and as to whether they feel safe within their community, safe at school. But we can create those safe spaces and amazing things happening in our schools. Really important for us to recognise and acknowledge what we are doing. But for some of our children, we can create, can't we, at school, that safety, being seen, being understood and being nurtured. But for some children, actually what might be going on is that an internal dialogue or worrying concerns that they might be carrying about their family, loved ones, things that they're hearing or seeing, for example, on the news as well. The other thing is to recognise that in the primary classroom, anxiety can look very different from what we might expect. It may not always be that quiet worry or those, for example, tears and upset. So I don't know if this is something that resonates for others, but it can appear as avoidance, and that tends to be one of the kind of big coping mechanisms as well, avoiding. And I don't know about anybody else, but if I'm feeling anxious, it's the pull to avoid anxiety provoking situations, even in my 50s, is there, and having to fight against that sometimes and face those things. It can be that perfectionism, so it might be that you've got pupils that academically are performing, high achievers, but actually what might be going on internally for that young person. So how they measure success, how they're able to manage and tolerate maybe mistakes or maybe not achieving what they would like it to be. We definitely see as well, don't we, anger. So that's something that we might observe in a young person. So, we could be seeing anger, but actually below the surface, it could actually be that they're experiencing anxiety. We see that withdrawal and we can see that challenging behaviour as well. So our role as educators, so I think one of the important things is to hold in mind that we're not expected to diagnose anxiety, absolutely not, but we are in powerful positions to create those classroom environments that hopefully mitigate and reduce anxiety and help our children feel safe, understood and capable. And here what you might be thinking about is actually the things that you do to make the environment feel safe, for children to feel seen, listened to, heard and understood, and actually to have that sense of belief in themselves. We won't be looking at today in kind of detail around self-harm, but self-esteem, apologies. But I think one of the things for us also to be aware of is that when children are struggling with their well-being, their mental health, maybe experiencing anxiety, sometimes anxiety also presents for pupils with low mood. Sometimes it doesn't, but it's recognising the complexities of mental health and emotions and well-being as well, is that for some of our children, they're equally struggling with low self-esteem and low self-worth as well. So maybe that sense of, I'm not good enough, I'm not going to achieve, I'm a failure. So how can we champion, their strengths and kind of take that strengths-based approach as well? And please, at the end, if anybody does want to share anything that you are doing or have noticed that actually has been really helpful, please make sure that you do. I think it's lovely where we can gift and share those things as well. So I'm just going to stop and pause again just for a moment, just for you to think about what words would you use to describe anxiety. So I've introduced us to it, but if you were to kind of have to kind of pick 2 or 3 words just on your own, just for a moment, think about what words would you use to describe anxiety. And here you might be thinking of those physical symptoms. I often think about how uncomfortable it feels, how overwhelming, you know, feeling your heart racing or feeling nauseous and feeling really sick. It can be incredibly overwhelming, can't it? But equally as well, for us just to remind ourselves as well that anxiety is actually innate in all of us and it is part and parcel. So sometimes children will feel a level of anxiety before they're doing something, but they're able to tolerate it, they're able to manage it, and then they look back and reflect and think, actually, that was perfectly natural, it was perfectly normal. I might feel a little bit nauseous or sick before something, but it's not stopping me from being able to kind of perform and do the things that I would like to do. And I'd just like to introduce you to, I don't know if anybody's come across it. I think this book is absolutely wonderful, and we'll make sure that we get a link in at the end just to think about normalising and talking about anxiety. And it's a book written particularly for primary school age, and it's called All Birds Have Anxiety. And it's just a beautiful book to introduce and to talk about anxiety and the idea that everybody will experience some level of anxiety. But we often, when we stop and pause, we maybe think about it at its worst case, and absolutely we need to be thinking about that. But a reminder that anxiety actually exists on a continuum as well. So really important for us just to think about ourselves, what we would think about, how we would describe anxiety in order to be able to kind of think about where our baseline is, and maybe that we need to kind of move or shift that slightly as well with that increased awareness and understanding. So as I was saying, anxiety, absolutely normal human response to perceived threat or uncertainty. So if we think for our children in primary school, what those things might be. I often give the example around kind of transitions in the sense that, you know, moving, getting ready, and some of you might be joining today that are year 6 teachers. But if we think about our children kind of as they're moving towards the end of primary school and that transition into high school, you know, for some children, perfectly natural and normal, you know, that level of anxiety and worry. What's it going to be like? Endings, you know, having loved school, you know, having trusted adults, those things. But for some children, if we think about, well, what's a kind of normal response, and maybe when anxiety is taking its toll, I'm sure some of you joining today will notice some children, even in year 4, for example, are already starting to kind of feel anxious and overwhelmed and worried about leaving primary school and going on to secondary school. So we can see the impact for some children that is greater than maybe others, where almost that phrase of water off a duck's back, that some people will be able to manage it as well. But for children, this threat may be that fear of failure. It could be that fear of separation. So I worked with a pupil who was finding it increasingly difficult to go into school. They were experiencing that emotionally based school avoidance. And actually, when they were enabled to be able to kind of share their journey and what was going on for them, actually what it was that they were just so worried that if they weren't with their caregivers, something bad would happen to their caregivers. So if I'm at home not well and mum or dad or carer is with me, at least I know that one of my trusted adults is safe. So that fear of separation can mean many things, and again, unique to each child as well. Maybe that fear of getting into trouble, fear of social situations, and again, that fear of unpredictability, because that in itself can create that increased anxiety and that increased worry. It's estimated that around 2 in 5 people are natural worriers as well. So I think we also have to take into account, you know, somebody's genetic makeup, they themselves as well, that for some people, worry is a big part of who they are as well. Not to say that that will become a barrier or an obstacle, but recognising again that some children will experience more kind of intense feelings and emotions and worry than others as well. So what we do know is a small amount of anxiety can be motivating, but when anxiety becomes overwhelming, it can interfere with learning and concentration, behaviour and emotional regulation. So we might see those kind of spikes during the day for some of our pupils where they find it really difficult to tolerate those difficult feelings and emotions, whether that be, you know, worried that they're going to get their work wrong, whatever it might be, that actually then you see maybe that fight, flight, freeze or fawn response. It could be attendance and participation. So like I was saying, you know, there will be and can be, you know, many reasons why a child might find it overwhelming and difficult to actually even get into school itself. And then that peer relationships as well. So, you know, very much really important. So sometimes our young people are really worried about their friendship groups. They might be experiencing, you know, some form of bullying. They might be kind of anxious about going into school as well. So, you know, that sense of belonging is incredibly important, isn't it? So if any of those things are off kilt, then in itself it can have an impact for our pupils. So this is the anxiety continuum. So not to say absolutely this is, you know, it neatly fitting into kind of boxes, but for us to think about when should we be worried or concerned, and we're very much thinking about, you know, the duration, we're thinking about the impact as well, so that we can recognize that anxiety is perfectly natural, it's innate in everybody. So actually all human beings will have some level of anxiety, and then it will start to move on that continuum. So starting to move to maybe where a child is experiencing that mild anxiety, so that everyday stress, upset or worry. So we're starting to notice through behaviour or through observations or through what's being verbalised that maybe there is something that is going on for that child that we need to be curious and inquisitive and kind of explore. And then unfortunately anxiety then can move to that threshold of a diagnosis as well, and kind of meeting that threshold of high anxiety. So the example I gave there about, you know, emotionally based school avoidance, you know, a child finding it incredibly difficult to even go into school, engage in school. They might be experiencing increased anxious thoughts, very much unwanted thoughts. So it's not that somebody is choosing to, but those anxious thoughts, those unwanted thoughts. So it might be, you know, second guessing, jumping to conclusions. It might be those physical symptoms, you know, racing heart. Some children and young people and adults have felt that, you know, they're experiencing, for example, a heart attack. So it could lend or lead itself to panic attacks, and very much that sense of not feeling okay. And then thinking about not just kind of how it's impacting in the context of that worry and anxiety, but also what we do know is, isn't it, that, you know, if a child's mental health starting to struggle, then it will have an impact on their physical health and vice versa as well. So we can recognise and thinking about how we talk and how we kind of reference and speak about anxiety, so that, you know, we're normalising that some level of anxiety is perfectly natural and normal, but actually when do we need to start to worry, when do we need to be concerned as well. And I think it's hard because working with secondary school and post 16 as well, you know, some teens or young adults have actually kind of looked back and said, you know, I actually started to notice an increased level of worry or anxiety or just feeling quite on edge or uncomfortable, probably from, you know, primary school age, but not necessarily recognising as well. So we absolutely know that early intervention and support is incredibly important. So how does anxiety present in the classroom? And I'm sure for all of you on the call today and those of you listening, you will be thinking about, children and young people that you are currently working with, or maybe children that you've worked with previously. And we know that anxiety in primary children can, not always, because I don't want to say that it's always misinterpreted as behaviour, but it's about recognising that actually it might present in lots of varied and different ways. And as I was saying at the beginning, the other thing is that, each child's experience of anxiety is unique to them, and also the reasons why that anxiety might have developed as well, so that we can think about the need for it to be nuanced, but what we can also look out for or recognise as well. So again, not an exhaustive list, but some of the things for us to think about in the context of how anxiety might present in the classroom. So we can think about those emotional signs. So it could be, for example, frequent tearfulness. It could be excessive worry or reassurance seeking. So I don't know if that's anything that resonates for people, but I don't mind sharing my son during his primary school years really did struggle with anxiety. And even though I'd worked in the field of mental health for many years in the NHS, I absolutely found myself falling into the reassurance trap. I just wanted to make things okay when he was experiencing anxiety. So he would often seek reassurance, and I often would find myself kind of trying to eliminate or take away situations, experiences or events that actually would cause him discomfort. And actually we had to go on a journey together to recognise and realise that actually, avoidance was just going to increase that kind of distress and that anxiety, and at times having to face fears and kind of be able to ride that wave. It was really hard, but it's about us recognising that our children sometimes will fall into those patterns and those behaviours, and we ourselves might fall into, offering that reassurance because we're just wanting to make things okay as well. It could be that low confidence or fear of making mistakes. Don't know about anybody else. I think it's something that I still find really difficult even as an adult to tolerate. Things need to be perfect, things need to be okay. So as adults and as educators or our roles in school, that we can actually gift our mistakes as well, to be able to normalise that it is okay to make those mistakes. Those behavioural signs, so it might be avoidance of tasks. Somebody, another young person that I was talking to was very much saying that they'd almost, written that end page. I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to engage in these lessons. I'm going to kind of find ways to get out of them because actually I don't think I'm going to be able to do them. I'm worried that I'm going to get things wrong. And that can be through perfectionism, or it could be, that core sense of low self-esteem and self-worth. We might also see anger, defiance or shutdown as well. And then one of the other things could be that clinginess to adults as well. So really finding it really difficult to tolerate not being in the presence of others as well. So some of the emotional signs, behavioural signs, you might be thinking of others that you've noticed and observed in others as well. And then the physical signs. And I think, for us to recognise and appreciate that, those physical signs, and sometimes these are the ones that children might find easier to express. I don't know for those of you listening, but I often think as adults, it can be really, really difficult, to express those feelings. I've worked with adults that have said, Gemma, I definitely know that I'm experiencing heightened anxiety, but I don't feel safe to share with others. So I might cite that I've got a migraine. I might say that I've got a stomach ache. So those physical signs, and interestingly, some of the physical things that are going on for children when they are experiencing anxiety, if we think they're getting ready, that perceived threat or danger. So even things like increased frequency of needing to go to the toilet could be something that's going on, irritable bowel, headaches, stomach aches, feeling nauseous, feeling sick, feeling really uncomfortable. And I don't know for anybody else, but when I'm feeling a high level of anxiety, I find it really difficult to sit still. So that fidgeting or restlessness, if we think about adrenaline pumping around the body. So for some children, when they are starting to notice or experience anxiety, actually how difficult it is to tolerate just sitting still and staying within that moment. So we can recognise, fidgeting, restlessness, it might be clenching of the fists. It equally might be fatigue as well, because I don't know for anyone else, I often find, it's incredibly exhausting, if you're on heightened alert, hypervigilant, and you're finding it really difficult and you're feeling really overwhelmed, that actually it can take a lot out of our children. So that fatigue as well. So recognising the different experiences our young people might be having. So again, not an exhaustive list, but for us to kind of think about, maybe some of the kind of behaviours that we might observe that we might not necessarily think are anxiety, for us to think about delving a little bit deeper, thinking about what our children might be carrying in that rucksack, that we can then start to think about actually, what might be going on for that child. And I always say the best and the most important thing is, creating those safe spaces for our children to be able to express what's going on for them. And they might not be able to do it just in this moment. Don't know about for anybody else. I had a teacher saying to me on a webinar previously, which has really stayed with me, is that, for one child, it was actually at the end of the school year on the school trip that they were walking together side by side. She'd felt that something wasn't right, and obviously had been kind of trying to build up and kind of be curious and ask those questions. And it was literally towards the end of the academic year when that child felt safe to share their story with a trusted adult. And it was a different environment, different place, not in the classroom. It was actually away from that and not having that eye contact, but that sideways listening as well. So if we start to think about maybe how the anxiety does present and how it can be different as well. So there we're thinking about, those nurturing environments. And I think today, as you join me on this webinar, or if you're listening, I think one of the other things as well is, it's really important that we stop and pause and, celebrate the things that we are doing. Because I think sometimes what happens, we can be our own worst enemies and kind of think about what we're not doing. But actually what's really important as well is to celebrate, the things that we are doing within our school settings. And one of the most important things is creating those nurturing environments, isn't it? So thinking about kind of where things are, but also as well, I think it can be helpful to stop and pause. I think we're always learning, aren't we? I still am learning today, 30 odd years on as well. And sometimes somebody reflects or kind of gives a perspective that maybe I haven't thought of, and I can take that away. So maybe for us just to think for a moment about thinking of a child you have worked with whose behaviour may have been linked to anxiety. So it might be something that I've said today, or you might be stopping and pausing and thinking, actually, maybe I need to be a little bit more curious and think maybe I was thinking that the behaviour was communicating X, where actually it might be that this child or young person is experiencing heightened anxiety. They might not be aware of that themselves, but together we can explore and think about what might be going on as well. So what are potentially common classroom anxiety triggers? So again, and you might have others that you'd like to add, but recognising, you know, those changes to routine. It could be unclear instructions. It might be time pressures, transitions between activities. It could be potentially sensory overload as well. So, you know, it's thinking about triggers, but I often also say it won't just be a trigger, almost that we think about actually those stressors. So, you know, it could be several of these that a child or young person is experiencing, and they might also be carrying other worries and concerns that they're experiencing as well. So we can think about potential classroom triggers, but also to think about what those children might be bringing into the classroom in the first place. So, you know, have they come to school today where already, you know, the environment at home has been overwhelming? Have they got friendship difficulties? Are they worried about things that are happening? Are they struggling or maybe having an ongoing physical health condition that's impacting? Have they been able to meet their dietary needs? Have they had something to eat? How's their sleep been? So lots of different things that might be contributing as well. So what do we see? And I've just included here the worry tree. I don't know if anybody has come across or used this before, but the idea as well, which can be really hard, is that sometimes for our children, we address one worry and then another worry happens and another worry and another experience, and almost like it's a magnifying glass, and that worry and anxiety just increasing and increasing. So then thinking about, you know, mitigating against or doing the best that we can do to either prevent anxiety or to support our pupils in the classroom or in school when it comes to anxiety as well. So you might have some wonderful suggestions around strategies that you found helpful, and I know that we've got the question and answers, but if anybody does want to share anything, we can definitely pick that up and share with everybody at the end. But I'm just going to spend the next 10 minutes or so kind of going through some of those strategies, and then we'll come to a close for an opportunity for any reflections and questions as well. So thinking about strategies, and I think here is as well, sometimes you might step away today and think, well, those are things that I've already been doing, and I think that's absolutely wonderful. So, you know, today is about, you know, acknowledging, you know, what things we are doing, and hopefully being able to think of other strategies that we might be able to take back into the classroom. So when we're thinking about anxiety, and anxiety in particular, it's really important to kind of acknowledge and recognise that predictability is incredibly important to kind of mitigate against those risks, or to kind of help support our children when it comes to anxious beings or having anxiety and worry. So clear routines and consistent expectations. So would the children be able to describe what the lessons, what's expected of them in the lesson, how it feels, what's going to happen at the end, what's going to happen at the beginning? Needing to have that preparation. So I don't know about anybody else, I definitely need to know, when it kind of helps with me if I'm ever feeling anxious, actually being prepared. And for our children, you know, thinking about those advanced warning for transitions or for change as well, which is incredibly important. And that's why I was giving the example of, you know, transitions or changes. And it can be, you know, term to term, it could be year to year. But, you know, for example, if a child has established, you know, their go-to adults, and they're already worried and concerned about who their teacher is going to be next year, having that level of calmness and kind of knowing what might be going on, really important. Clarity, so chunking up instructions and thinking about those visual supports. And also what can be really helpful is choice, so small controlled choices to increase a sense of control. And that's where that young person that I was thinking about at the beginning, was saying, school's been absolutely brilliant, Gemma. It's been so beneficial for me. There's somebody that actually moved schools in year 3 and they're now in year 5. And they've said there's been some wonderful kind of things that have happened and strategies, but there are a couple of things that I know that would be really, really helpful for me as well. So being able to kind of verbalise what's helpful and maybe not helpful, because I think we can all do that. I can sometimes think, well, this would be helpful, but actually am I thinking about it because I'm almost applying it to what would be helpful to me, but to somebody else it might not. And that's the nuances as well, about those individual needs. So yesterday I was delivering some training actually post 16 and kind of getting to think about having personalised anxiety support plans. So that might be something also that we can think about, because for each pupil, what might be helpful for them might not necessarily be helpful for another pupil. So it does not complicate, but it just is that reminder that some of the things we might think about might be helpful for one pupil, but for another pupil it might be that we have to think about other strategies that we can draw on and we can use as well. So key is around building that emotional safety, so our children feel safe, they feel secure, they feel seen, and the things that we are doing on a day-by-day basis that will build that emotional safety, and hopefully then feel as if things feel safe coming into school and things feel safe within the classroom as well. So again, just some practical strategies in thinking about building safety. So, greeting our children by name, using that calm, respectful language, all of the things that we will be doing on a day-by-day basis. Thinking about how we can gift those mistakes, normalising mistakes as part of learning. For some children, they will find that really difficult, and learning to tolerate, making mistakes or maybe not getting 20 out of 20 in a test, because the work does need to get harder to test and to challenge as well. Can we ourselves, and you might be doing this already, but modelling that emotional regulation, so, that we can articulate and maybe say, I sometimes feel anxious or I feel frustrated, so I'm going to take a breath. So we're role modelling and we're demonstrating and we're showing actually ourselves as kind of authentic human beings as well. And to hold in mind and think about, language absolutely matters, doesn't it? So, sometimes if we're not at our best and calm and regulated, maybe how we might respond, and so we can stop and pause and ground ourselves and, maybe not responding in that moment. So we can think about, I can see this feels hard, let's take a moment together. So we're kind of grounding ourselves together and we're not responding and ourselves moving into either hyper or hypo as well. So really important as well that we recognise, within ourselves, our own feelings and emotions as well. Teaching regulation skills explicitly, so thinking about breathing strategies. So, for example, it could be smell the flower, blow out the candle. It could be the grounding exercises. So I don't know if you use or have used, and I've often spoken to parent and carers as well, the grounding exercise based on the 5 senses can be really, really helpful in that moment when maybe emotions are escalating and a child or young person is starting to feel overwhelmed as well. We know movement breaks, and as I was saying earlier, if we think for children with high levels of anxiety or experiencing anxiety and adrenaline going around their body, thinking about their nervous system, then what's really important as well is to recognise that sitting still can be incredibly difficult. So having those regular movement breaks, so whether that's stretching or whether introducing some chair yoga, just those interventions and support that we can embed on a day-by-day basis for all of our pupils as well. Having those calm down spaces, so a safe space for regulation, and hopefully these strategies, over time, and kind of really making that commitment is that hopefully these strategies should be practiced when children are calm. So we're starting to think about not in those kind of moments where things feel terribly overwhelming, but starting to embed these as well. Available to all pupils, 'cause I think that's the other thing that's really important, and potentially something that you are doing anyway is, you know, all of our children being able to have the opportunity to be able to regulate and be supported to regulate. And also another thing is just how it's framed. So framed as tools, not consequences. And again, you know, just that importance of recognizing, you know, the work that is going on within our school settings as well. Supporting anxious moments in the classroom. So thinking about when a child is anxious, we keep our voice calm and slow, because sometimes we can feel that anxiety in ourselves. So actually we can start to kind of notice maybe that we're starting to feel a little bit anxious, kind of worried as well. So if we regulate ourselves first. Reducing language, so really important, less is more. So, you know, the idea being that we're listening to understand, not to answer. So giving that quiet time, that space as well. Acknowledging feelings without escalating, offering those simple next steps. So it could be, you don't have to do it all, just start with the first line. Would you like to try this together, or take a short break first? So maybe when, you know, work is becoming really difficult for a child, kind of grounding them as well, and kind of being able to talk through and kind of look at those strategies together as well. So some of the kind of suggestions and tips. And then I'm just including here some more of those classroom top tips. So thinking about teaching about anxiety, including the physiology and thinking errors. So when I'm talking about those thinking errors, it's thinking about those unwanted thoughts. So it could be those perfectionist traits, second guessing, all or nothing, catastrophizing as well. Using our emotional coaching teaching style as well, really important. It might be kind of using visual timetables and linking those with home as well. Don't know if anybody does use worry boxes, worry monsters, worry time, really important as well. And that's something that, you know, sometimes parent and carers actually do at home, is rather than focusing on the worries and anxieties for a never-ending amount of time, actually kind of box it to 10 minutes of worry time, talking about things, and then moving to a distraction activity as well. It could be, for example, if we think about some of our children where getting into school can be incredibly difficult and really overwhelming, is maybe accommodating those late arrivals, early leaving if needed, thinking about setting up those calm corners as well, as an example. And then just to hold in mind, allowing extra time for transitions, having that safe place if a child develops increased anxiety or is experiencing panic. So it could be have a plan. So coping cards can be really useful, lists, reminders about anxiety and those coping tips as well. Sometimes people will use thought challenges and exposure reminders as well that can be really helpful. And I just draw you with some of the tips and strategies that people, I don't know if anybody has come across. I'm trying to get this into the camera as well. One of the other resources and books that many schools, so you might already yourselves have, or signposting parent and carers to, it's a great book, is Starving the Anxiety Gremlin. And that's got a lot of activities and exercises as well that can be used either in school or collaboratively together with parent and carers, so that you've got that support network around. So that might be something else that you might want to take a look at as well. And then I just want to move to a close in case we've got any questions and answers. And I know that I've covered quite a lot, so you'll need to also process as well. But just holding in mind that logic does not work when a child is emotionally overwhelmed, to hold in mind that connection really does come first. So every calm, kind interaction plants the seed of safety that helps a child grow. And I just want to say thank you very much. Please do visit our website at Cog-Spark. You can drop me an email as well, but lots of information and resources there.